he's got a point. Sex is almost everywhere in our culture. So it's quite natural that we have a lecture and a discussion about sex. But it's also a huge challenge, not least for me as a presenter, because I know, of course, that we all come from very different perspectives and directions when we approach a subject like sex. For some of us, sex is not a big issue. Our focus is on other areas of life. For others, sex is a struggle and a frustration, maybe connected with pain, deep pain or shame. For others, sex is really a positive power, a source of joy and intimacy. And so coming from so many different directions, in one sense, it's a subject better suited for a personal conversation, a more kind of low-key dialogue. But it's not an either or. We need good personal conversations where we can share our struggles and our life stories. But I think we also need a public conversation about sex, about understanding our own culture in terms of its view of sex, and a Christian understanding of the body and of sex. So I'm happy that we have this opportunity together. Now, a lot of people in our culture, they often, I think, at least that's true for Sweden, they try to silence the Christian voice when it comes to sex. So they say, relax, why are you so obsessed with sex? In my view, that's a very strange accusation. It's contemporary culture that is obsessed with sex. And we are bombarded daily with messages about sex. So why should everyone else have an opinion about sex, except for the Christian? That's strange. When I look to the Christian church, at least here in Sweden, it is often actually silent on this issue because it's much more comfortable to just leave sex out of the teaching because it's complicated and sensitive. And so the result, I think, is that too many churches just walk over in terms of the view of sex. Another accusation is that Christians are hypocrites. And of course, that's a painful accusation. And there is some truth to the accusation. But I think we need to think through this issue about being a hypocrite quite carefully. A hypocrite is someone who accuses other people of wrongdoing and pretending to pass the test themselves. But in reality, they are practicing the sin they condemn. That's a hypocrite. The problem here lies not in the fact that you teach a certain moral principle, nor in the fact that you have yourself, nor in the fact that you yourself have failed to live up to it. But the problem is to pretend to apply a principle when you don't. We can think of a principle like, you should not lie. Is it only people who have never said anything untrue that has the right to affirm that principle? Of course not. It is the one who says, you should not lie, and pretend to have never lied that can be a hypocrite when it's revealed that that is not true. So the fact that we may break our own moral principles does not in itself make us hypocrites. Sinners, that's true, when we break a moral principle, but not automatically a hypocrite. So it's a question about being honest. It's a question about being ready to admit our own brokenness and to be humble in relationship to our moral convictions. And I hope it is in that light we can discuss the issues this afternoon. Personally, I'm deeply marked by John's Gospel, chapter 8, and Jesus' word in the discussion around a sexually compromised woman, where Jesus is saying, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone." So be assured, I'm not here to throw any stones today. Well, the point so far is that I don't think there are any good reasons for Christians to be silent. I think we need to join the conversation about sex. The church father, Chrysostom, he is quoted to have said, "We must not mind insulting men if by respecting them we offend God." So of course, for a Christian, God is the highest principle, and we do not want to be politically correct just in order to affirm our contemporary culture. But on the other hand, it's equally important to actually show respect toward each other. So I hope we can conduct the discussion with that attitude. Let me, here at the beginning of my presentation, just put my cards on the table. There are three fundamental premises behind my thinking on sex, and I just want to let you know just from the start. Firstly, I think about sex from the perspective of design, what we are designed for as human beings. What is the meaning behind the fact that we are bodily and sexually beings? So I'm not interested in arbitrary moral rules. I'm not governed by tradition, as if that in itself shows what is right. And the main point for me is not even that some things are written in a book. What do I mean by that? I mean this: even if the Bible didn't say anything about sex at all, it would still be true that there is a design behind us as human beings. And I'm really interested in looking at the design. What are we designed for? What's the meaning with our bodies? Secondly, of course, as a Christian, I think about sex from the perspective of the Bible, because the Bible do speak about sexuality and put into words the meaning of God's design. And of course, as a Christian, I want to, and I'm obliged to listen and obey God's word. The God who speaks to us is the one who has created us and designed us. And I think in the Bible that we have really a revolutionary view of sex. And we are coming to that soon. Thirdly, I think about sex from the perspective of the gospel. That means that we can talk about sex within a framework of hope. Because in the gospel, we are offered forgiveness for our past, and there is an encouragement about our future. So we are not locked in to our own mistakes or our own weaknesses, but we can discuss a subject like sex from a framework of hope. So that's really important for me when approaching this subject. Now, my presentation will have two main points. I will talk about the sexual revolution that has happened in our culture and try to describe and analyze that. And then I will secondly talk about the Bible's revolutionary view of sex. So let's move into that. First, the sexual revolution. When we think about the sexual revolution, we can think of Sweden in the 1960s, because unfortunately my culture took the lead in applying the sexual revolution and free sex, and Swedish sin became a concept. Swedish movies traveled all over the world. So sexual revolution was connected to Sweden. But we have to go further back to Germany in Berlin in the 1920s to follow the ideas of the sexual revolution. And actually, we need to go behind Berlin in the 20s, back to the late 19th century and the free thinkers in many places in Europe. And actually, we need to go back all the way to the Enlightenment and to one famous individual, and that is Marquis de Sade, who has been called the founder of eroticism. Now, make no mistake, his time was not an ideal golden time that he started to deviate from, far from it. He lived in a time where there was a need for a sexual revolution. There were brothels and prostitutes all over Europe. Aristocrats, rich elite were using young women and then just throwing them away when they became pregnant. There was a horrifying inequality between men and women in many areas, including marriage and sex. So there was really a need for a sexual revolution. But it was not that kind of sexual revolution that Marquis de Sade launched. No, Marquis de Sade, he took the atheistic ideas of the Enlightenment and applied them to sexuality. So he accepted the idea that there is no God, there is no creator, there is no design, there is no meaning behind the universe, behind us as human beings, behind our bodies, behind the different functions of our body, like sexuality. Since there is no God, there's no binding moral values, there's no purpose, there's no goal. And he applied the principle that Alexander Pope have formulated as whatever is right. Whatever is a fact can also be judged morally right. So, for example, in most cases, a man is physically stronger than a woman and can therefore do whatever he wants physically or sexually with the woman, because what is right. Now, Marquis de Sade has written some of the darkest and most evil books ever written, where he is describing the consequences of this way of life. From Marquis de Sade, there is a line to the Austrian and German psychiatrist Wilhelm Reich. He is the one who actually coined the term the sexual revolution, and that's the title of one of his books. He saw a sexual revolution in progress coming from Marquis de Sade and moving through history, and there is no power in his mind on earth that will stop it. Wilhelm Reich saw the entire human existence in the light of sexuality. And he could say things like this: the pleasure of living and the pleasure of orgasm are identical. And he claimed that it's necessary for happiness and well-being to have a certain number of orgasms a week. So it's making human life into the sexual life. And if human life and sexual expression are identical, then of course it's very problematic if there are any limitation on sexuality. So the sexual revolution that Reich imagined was to liberate sexuality from all inhibitions, from all limitations. So he launched a program where he wanted to release sexuality, so life and sex, actually becomes identical. In order to do that, he wanted the abolition of the lifelong monogamous marriage. So open up for free sex in all different versions. He wanted to encourage infantile and adolescent sexuality, to take away the age limits. He saw suppression of the sexual urge as destructive, and abstinence, not to live out your sexuality, as a kind of sickness. It's pathological. We need to express ourselves in sexual acts. And he wanted to eliminate the whole category of perversion, sexual perversion, that there's something that is morally wrong, that is perverse, that's not the way it should be in terms of sexuality. If you think of his revolution, you have to say he's been extremely successful. Our culture had moved in the direction of Wilhelm Reich's sexual revolution in all the areas except one. We still draw a really strong line against the connection between sex and children, infantile sexuality. We want to protect minors. But in all other areas, our culture have moved in the direction Reich wanted to see. So another way of describing this is to say that we have separated sex from marriage. Of course, you can have sex as a married person, but you can also have sex outside of marriage, before marriage, with someone you are not married to. We have separated sex from love. Of course, you can have sex in a love relationship, but you can also have sex in a relationship where there is no love. So you can have friends with benefits. You can have sex with in many different constellations. We have separated sex from permanence. Of course, you can have sex in a long-lasting permanent relationship, but you can also have a one-night stand. We have separated sex from procreation. Of course, you can still have sex in order to have a child, but you can also separate it totally and just ignore procreation and forget about that dimension. Of course, we still see some kind of connection between sex and the body, but we also do all we can to separate sex from what our bodies tells us about sexuality. So we have made sex into something which is independent of marriage and love and permanence and procreation, and actually from the signals of our own body. The consequences have been dramatic. Marquis de Sade and Wilhelm Reich, and so many who was driving the sexual revolution in the 60s in Sweden, they saw it as a positive liberation. The consequences will be beautiful and good. People will be freer, happier. There will be much more enjoyment and pleasure. Love will flourish. Freedom from all those restrictions in terms of sexuality will create a much better culture, and people will be happier. Well, the revolution has not delivered. The consequences have been, in many cases, horrible. And if we have had the time, we could gone through all the statistics of what has happened in terms of family stability. What we see is the breakdown of marriage and families and relationships. We can look at the consequences of human life. If you just take Germany, England, France, and Spain, 4 of the big countries in Europe, in 1 year, there are over 600,000 abortions. And of course, an unwanted pregnancy is the consequences of the sexual revolution. So our view on human life has really changed, and here's a huge tragic here. We could have looked into the statistics on health. Sexually transmitted disease in various forms are spreading and are in many cases rather destructive. And one of the areas where there was a lot of promise was that this will liberate women. But Francis Fukuyama, who is an historian who is most famous for his book, The End of History, he has written this. He is describing what has happened the last 50 years in the Western culture out from the sexual revolution. And he says, one of the greatest frauds perpetrated during the Great Disruption, that's the last 50 years, was the notion that the sexual revolution was gender neutral, benefiting women and men equally, and that it somehow had a kinship with the feminist revolution. In fact, the sexual revolutions served the interests of men, and in the end put sharp limits on the gains that women might otherwise have expected from their liberation from traditional roles. So he's saying that women have been the losers as a consequence of the sexual revolution. And we have seen this, of course, so clearly in the Me Too movement. With all the sad and painful and horrible stories of how men have taken advantage of women sexually. So the sexual revolution has not delivered on its promise. It has hurt us deeply, individually and culturally. It has not liberated sex. It has not liberated us as human beings. It's interesting, the Me Too movement was biggest in Sweden of all countries. And of course, there's a connection. The sexual revolution has gone further in Sweden than in and maybe in any other country. And therefore, the Me Too was bigger here because people are suffering under the sexual revolution. This is, of course, just a very quick overview. We could have gone deeper into this. But I think this is enough to say there is a need for a better way, a better understanding of sex, of the body, and of human relationships. And I think that the Bible offers us a very interesting perspective here that is really worth listening to. So secondly, some words about the Bible's revolutionary view of sex. The theologian George Weigel, he has said, for the Christian quote, the first moral question shifts from what am I forbidden to do to how do I live a life of sexual love that conforms to my dignity as a human person. I think that's a key quote. The point with the Christian view is not what is forbidden. Where is that line? The first question is about what am I designed for? What conforms to my dignity as a person and to the other person's dignity as a person. That is the starting point of reflection. Of course, then later on, there is a need to also draw lines and say, that is not right, that we should not go that way. But the starting point is, who are we as human beings? The Bible addresses sex in this context. And we have the first words on sexuality on the first page of the Bible. And that is connection with God creating human beings in his image as male and female. And God explains why we have a body, why we're male and female, and what his thought behind that is. And if we ask the question, why sex, to the first chapters of the Bible, the first answer is procreation. And that is, of course, the biological function of sexuality. And in the Bible, it means that we are called to be co-creators with God. He created a human being and then said to them, multiply and be fruitful, have sex, and I want to see many human beings. But that is not the only aspect of sex, of course not. In chapter 2, where there is more details about God creating us as male and female, there is not a word about procreation. The focus is on another aspect of sexuality, namely, it is a sign of unity. There is a relational aspect, a communicative aspect, a joyful, sensual aspect of two people being joined together. And when we continue to read in the Bible, there is a whole book, the Song of Songs, which focuses on sensualism, of the pleasure, of the beauty, of the joy, of the excitement of male and female love and a longing to be united. So in the Bible, we have a broad perspective on sexuality. It's not just one aspect, it's the fullness of what sex is, and it relates to who we are as human beings. When Jesus in the Gospels are asked questions about marriage and divorce and this whole area of life, what Jesus is doing is that he quotes from Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, the two starting chapters in the Bible. And he says to the people who come with the questions to him, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? That's Genesis 1. And that he said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. That is Genesis 2. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Whatever God has joined together, let not man separate. So in a Christian understanding, Genesis 1 and 2 are the crucial starting point and the basis for a Christian understanding. If we then go deeper into what Genesis 1 and 2, and then Jesus affirms in the gospel, you can say that what we are given here is a definition of marriage as the place for the sexual relation. What I mean is this. When God explains the fact that we are male and female, he says, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and let me see if I quote it right. Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. That becomes like a definition of marriage. A marriage is a monogamous relation. It's a man and his wife. So the Bible says no to polygamy, even though a lot of people in biblical times had multiple number of wives and lived a polygamous lifestyle. That goes against the Creator's design from the beginning. His thought was a man and his one wife, one man and one woman. The design was a heterosexual relationship, a man and his wife. Now, of course, that raises so many questions in our culture, and we can come back to that in the Q&A. I don't have the time to address them. I can just see that the Bible starts with this definition: a man and his wife. Thirdly, there is a social dimension to this. A man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife. I'm not sure we understand the significance of this, but we need to understand it in the light of the ancient Orient culture, where you are really obliged to honor your father and your mother. But here it says you should leave them. There should be a kind of break, because you are called to create a new social unit. There's a change of the social status, and that change is important for the rest of the community. Fourthly, the man should hold fast to his wife, and of course the wife to her man. And Jesus implies that ideally that is a lifelong fidelity, a lasting relationship. And it is in this context that sex belongs. That relationship is completed in the sexual union. They are to become one flesh, to be a unity, which in the Hebrew here have sexual connotations, of course, to become one flesh. Out from this comes an understanding in the Bible that marriage is a covenant. It's not just an agreement between two parties that can then be renegotiated further along the way and changed. This is a covenant that is a much, much deeper commitment. So in Malachi, it talks about your wife by covenant. And the covenant is created by a public promise and confirmed in the sexual union. Sometimes I hear people, Christians, saying a marriage is established by the sexual act. But I think that's not true. It's not the sexual act that establishes a marriage. A marriage is established when you enter into the covenant and you say, I do. And that's why the pastor, if it's or a priest, if it's in a church, after the I do, say, I declare you man and wife. That's the point where the covenant is established. And that covenant, when two people have promised to give themselves for the rest of their lives to each other, that covenant is confirmed in the sexual union, where they bodily illustrate what they have already said with their words, that they belong to each other. In the New Testament, you can read words like this. This is from Hebrews 13. Marriage should be honored by all, and the marriage bed kept pure. So this is a very, very different understanding of sexuality. But I think it is an understanding that is in line with who we are as human beings. The English journalist and author G.K. Chesterton has said, free love is a contradiction in terms. The definition of love is a limitation to a certain object. I think he has a great point. In the sexual revolution, they have chosen to talk about free love, but that is not at all what it is. It's free sex. But they have tried to disguise it under the label free love. But free love is a contradiction in terms, because love is specific. Love means a limitation to a certain object, to a certain person. And in the marriage, you're formalizing that limitation. This is the person that I will love and cherish and hold on to until death do us apart. It is this one unique relationship. Even though a lot of, for example, secular Swedes, they would have a lot of questions and objections towards the Christian understanding of sex and its connection to marriage, I still think that there are some important pointers in everyone's life towards this understanding. Let me explain what I mean. I think the Christian understanding of sex takes seriously what we all already know about sex. For example, in the legal sphere, all over Europe and in most countries, we do a distinction between physical assault and rape. So, so it's a worse crime to rape someone than to punch them in the stomach. Why is that? If sex is only two body parts touching each other, why make that kind of distinction? Well, everyone knows that sex is something much deeper. That if you have been sexually assaulted, you can be traumatized for years. There can be very deep scars. If someone punches you in the stomach, that hurts, but you are not traumatized in the same way. And the legislators have recognized that, and that's why we are making a difference between physical assault and rape and other sexual acts. Because we know it is a unique bodily act. In light of that, it makes sense that that unique bodily act belongs to a unique relation. Or think of another aspect. In secular Europe, secular Sweden, people have many different sexual relationships, especially when they are young and they are students and so on. And then sooner or later, they meet the one they really want to share their life with. When that happens, suddenly something new comes into play. Now, unfaithfulness becomes very disturbing if the one I love has sex with someone else. Because in a love relationship, sex is the sign of belonging. It's an unique, exclusive sign that signifies what is between the two of us that is not between us and anyone else. And that's why unfaithfulness threatens the whole relationship. Now, this makes our culture very incoherent, because in some parts of our life we say, oh, sex is no big deal. I can have sex with that person or that person. It's not a big thing. And then suddenly the same act is a really big thing that threatens everything. We don't have a coherent view of sexuality and the meaning of sex. This was powerfully illustrated in the movie with Tom Cruise and Cameron Diaz. The movie is Vanilla Sky. And Tom Cruise play a man called David, and he has a relationship with Julie, played by Cameron Diaz. But when she discovers that he have had sex with another woman also, she says to him, don't you know that when you sleep with someone, your body makes a promise whether you do or not? Your body makes a promise whether you do or not. I think that's a powerful illustration of actually what the Christian view of sex underlines. In his famous book, Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis puts it in this way. The monstrosity of sexual intercourse outside of marriage is that those who indulge in it are trying to isolate one kind of union, the sexual, from all the other kinds of union, which were intended to go along with it and make up the total union. So this would be a broad overview of the Christian view of sex. Of course, it raises all kinds of questions and objections. I'm fully aware of that. And I would be happy to try to discuss them and address them. But I want us to have a good chunk of time to do that. So just let me say this as I end my presentation. This Christian view of sex is put into a larger view of life. A Christian view of sex says that sex is good, but it's not ultimate. Sex is not what defines us as human being. Life is bigger and richer than sex. Sex is one good and positive aspects of human life, but it's not defining us as persons. Marriage is a good institution, and it's the institution where sex belongs. But singleness and celibacy is also good and frees you up to do things you cannot do and express things you cannot express as a married person. So this is, from the Christian point of view, a question about different callings with a common goal, namely to reflect who God is and express love and goodness in this world. And you can do that as a married person or as a single person. You can do that as someone who expresses yourself sexually within a marriage covenant, or you can do that as a person who lives in celibacy and can serve people in many ways with that calling. For everyone, according to the Christian faith, we are called to live for the glory of God. Let me end by a quote from a book called entitled From Shame to Sin. It's written by historian Kyle Harper, and he describes the view on sex in the ancient Rome, and how the emerging Christian movement interacted with the sexual culture of antiquity, and how gradually the sexual revolution overtook the very promiscuous and decadent ancient Rome. And this is what he says. The most astonishing development of late antiquity is the transformation of a radical sexual ideology, and that is the Christian faith he calls a radical sexual ideology. For centuries, the possession of a small strident band of vociferous dissenters, into a culture, a broadly shared public framework of values and meanings. In the early centuries, the Christian leadership spoke in an apologetic key. This fact shaped the entire tonal arrangement of early Christian moralizing. So what he's saying here is that from the beginning, the Christian movement was, of course, a minority with an odd view of sex in the light of the general culture. But gradually, the Christian movement transformed the understanding of sex and relationships in Europe. And it was because the Christian leadership were not silent on those issues, but spoke in an apologetic key. That means they explained and defended their position. And gradually, more and more people became convinced and saw the beauty and the goodness of the Christian position. And I think we are in a place where we need to see that process happening all over once again in Europe. Okay, thank you for listening. Over to you, Alexander, to lead the Q&A.